wood is an interesting subject. Wood is anisotropic, which means it has different properties one direction to another. It's not like plastic, which moves and flexes, if it does, in the same direction exactly the same way. Wood has long fibers, so along the wood it's very, very stiff generally and doesn't shrink in that long direction, but it does shrink in the lateral direction across the grains, and it's much more flexible across the grains.
I had such a great time talking with today's guest. I am Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with Sydney, Australia-based luthier Matthew Tucker. Matthew runs a company called Bresque Basses, and he has been innovating in all sorts of fascinating ways. In fact, when I was at the Violin Society of America workshop, the VSA workshop in Oberlin in the summer of 2018, they called Matthew one of their resident geniuses. Matthew has gone to this workshop. We talk about that, and he's come up with this responsive flatback bracing system. So we dig into that, what it does, how it works on new basses, old basses, why he found that this was something that we really needed in the bass world. We also talk about how he treats basses like patients. It's a really interesting concept, just how he got into the business. He's got a great story, great guy, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Upton Bass, D'Addario Strings, Robertson & Sons, and A440, and you'll hear more from them later in the episode. But let's jump into this conversation with Matthew Tucker. Oh, well, hey, I'm glad that we waited till after the VSA because I got a chance to see your system in action, and super cool. And everybody, Cole, I think they refer to as one of their resident mad geniuses, the other VSA guys. So
that's nice of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the name, maybe we could start with just talking about that bracing system. So you call it responsive flatback bracing. Is that what you refer to it as?
Yes, I've thought about it quite a bit, what to call it. Some people have said, well, it's going to get known as Tucker bracing, whether you like it or not. But I thought, well, look, it needs to have a name that describes what it actually does. Right. And the way I've designed it, it's responsive, and that's an adjective that people understand. Certainly people who are web savvy understand what a responsive website is. It adapts to what's going on around it and what device it's being used on. So yeah, I'm calling it responsive bracing because that's what it does. It responds to what the wood wants to do.
And you've even got up on your site demo of you have, I think it's a guitar back, right? A guitar flat back with the traditional brace. And it's remarkable. I'll make sure to link up to that. But you can see on the guitar back with the traditional, what did you call that? Ladder bracing? Is that what you call the traditional?
Cross bracing, yeah.
Okay. Because you can see, the guitar back has. I mean, it looks like it's warped, but there's a term for that.
It's cupping, I think we call it, because on a bass it tends to cave inwards.
Okay.
So what's going on there is that the wood is shrinking. It's quarter sawn wood, so the grain runs it runs in a vertical direction from the top of the bass to the bottom, and the wood is shrinking. But on one side of the wood, which is the braced side, the braces have the grain running across the wood, and that doesn't shrink in that direction. It's just the nature of wood. And what happens is that because one part of the wood is shrinking and the other side of the wood isn't shrinking, then the whole thing will move. And it's not just shrinking; it'll expand as well. The same thing happens. Depending upon if you go into a humid environment, the same thing, the wood of the back will swell, but where it is constrained from doing so, it won't swell. So it just has to move. It's a bit like a bimetallic strip, but it's made of wood instead. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I'll be sure to link up so people can see like what it looks like. And you do that. So you do this on your basses, but that you're making yourself, but also you've retrofitted some other basses with this system as well. Yes,
I came at this when I was repairing a bass of mine that I had at Arnold's shop. It was my silver medal bass from 2013, or was it 2015? 2015, and that bass was lent out to someone on approval in winter in New York, and came back with a big crack up the middle of the back, exactly caused by shrinkage, and the braces couldn't cope, and there was a crack, and one of the braces popped up. So when I went to Oberlin, I pulled the back off it, and I decided I needed to repair it. So I repaired the back with a center spline right up the back, a center strip. That went really well, and then it came time to rebracing it. So I thought, well, what am I going to do? I can't really just put cross braces on again, because it's going to go back to Arnold's shop, and maybe the same thing's going to happen. So then I had a bit of a think and developed the responsive bracing system, which is like two inverted parentheses on the back and a little inverted boomerang at the bottom. And since that time, when I have a bass that's coming in with a cracked back and has, and it could be an old bass, could be just a customer's bass that has bracing problems, it has cracks, which is very common in flatback basses, I seriously consider putting, if it's going to be rebraced, putting the responsive bracing system in there, because I don't think there is any downside whatsoever.
Yeah, and it sounds like such a great system.
People ask me what it sounds like, and I've only been doing this for 2 years. I don't know really that I can give a response to that, because it's unless you do a lot of these and replace the cross bracing with the responsive bracing and compare before and afterwards, and you know the bass really well, it's really difficult to evaluate what effect it has on the tone. But I think that just the fact that I'm putting something in there that I believe is going to outlast traditional cross bracing has to have something going for it. It certainly doesn't seem to impede the tone, and it's like trying to compare X bracing with ladder bracing. How do you compare the tone there? What does that sound like? It's difficult to evaluate. I suppose you could say, well, what I'm trying to do with a flatback bass is more akin to the sort of structure that you would have in a roundback bass. Mm-hmm. In that I'm leaving the edges of the plate free to move. I'm not constraining them. I'm providing thickening in the middle of the plate to support the sound post, and effectively with the long curved braces, I'm supporting the sound post all the way up and down the back.
And the problem with the X bracing, you have similar structural problems with X bracing, right? Over time, things will start to move.
I haven't experienced it, because I haven't seen that any X-braced backs down in Australia here. I think that X bracing is a lot better than ladder bracing, the cross bracing. I think if you do ladder bracing correctly, and by that I mean fairly lightly and in a very controlled environment, you can have some success with the wood. It needs to be very dry and very stable. But not everybody has that environment, and certainly the old makers didn't have that environment. They didn't have air conditioning, which is the problem that we're all facing.
Right.
I probably went off track a little bit with that question.
No. It's great.
X-bracing is a lot better than the ladder bracing. And there are other variants of the X-bracing. Arnold is now using a large diagonal brace. You probably saw that at Oberlin as well, a large diagonal brace and a couple of small braces heading off to the side, covering the larger expanses of the upper and lower bout. But that system, there's something about it that doesn't appeal to me. Maybe it's the straight lines. Maybe it's the fact that it looks like a 4x2 glued into the back. It just didn't seem to me to have an acoustic or structural integrity. I'm sure it works very well, but being the sort of person I am, I thought that the laminated and curved bracing system that I've got was an improvement.
Yeah. It's so exciting to me to see all these different experimentations that are going on in the luthiery. I feel so lucky to have been able to be at that event and just see what people are doing. And one thing that came up and you just mentioned this too is the issue with you make a bass in one climate and then it goes to a different climate. I think David Gage was saying that Nick Lloyd is now doing what he calls New York style basses for someone that buys one and takes it to New York because it's such a drastic climate. And if you're sitting at maybe 50 or 60% humidity, making a bass, and then it goes to a Las Vegas or New York in the winter, I mean, things are just going to change, right? I mean, it's just the instruments traditionally over the centuries, they probably more often were played where they were made. Now it's
right.
global.
I have an instrument in the workshop at the moment. It's a large English bass with a very thick back, very thick maple back. The back is up to 14 millimeters thick in some places, so it's a really big chunk of wood. It has one fairly wide cross brace under the sound post, and while I was doing a restoration on the top, this bass was sitting in the corner with you usually just wedge a piece of wood or a strut or some kind of, I'd actually screwed some pieces of wood across the blocks to keep the shape while I was working in the workshop. But it got very dry here. That bass is normally kept in an air-conditioned environment. It got very dry in the workshop over a period of several months while I was doing the restoration. And when it came time to put the top back on, I took the temporary bracing off the ribs, off the corners, and the whole rib cage just went sploing. And when I tried to put the belly back on, the ribs were overlapping by about an inch. Sticking out by about an inch, and the back of the bass had cupped quite extraordinarily amount, and this was just due to the dryness. The back has shrunk. The brace on the brace under the sound post was just holding it. Now the brace was half an inch thick, right? The back is 15 millimeters. You'd think a piece of wood like that wouldn't move, but it does, and it's the cross brace that actually caused it to move. And I tried to pull that rib cage back into submission to match the top, and it just would not budge. This is a real big bass. The wood is old and nice and strong, but it just wouldn't budge. And in the end, I had to build a box and rehumidify that bass back to about 65% relative humidity, and magically the back flattened out and the ribs fit exactly.
Wow.
So it's a really big demonstration. And what that tells me is that when that bass was glued together, when that brace was put in originally, it was probably put in at around about 65% relative humidity, which sounds like England to me, or possibly Melbourne, because that's where the repair person in the 1800s. There was a repair person, John Devereux, who did some work on the bass. He has his label on the cross brace, so it's likely that he put that cross brace in. And Melbourne is known for being a bit more of a wet climate than Sydney is. So quite possibly it was put in at around about 60-65% relative humidity and glued up, and that's the humidity that it likes.
Okay.
If it was put in, if the brace was glued in a very dry environment, then drying it out wouldn't be an issue. But if you took it into a humid environment, it would bow the other way, it would bulge outwards.
Yeah. At the VSA this past week, Robbie McIntosh was talking. He was talking about how so air conditioning is an issue, but what a huge issue central heat is, and how it's such a relatively modern invention. And before that, you'd have a heat source in the house. Maybe you'd have a fireplace, but the rest of the house would be cold. It wouldn't be artificially heated. And so someplace like New York or some other cold place, you turn that heat on, and that's just a circumstance that an instrument built in 1850, 1900, that's just not that wasn't part of the game when that was happening, when that was being made.
Right. So that's right. And as you were saying before, an instrument built in one environment would probably stay in that environment for a long time. And if it did move, it would move on the back of a horse and cart or on a boat, which would be enough time to let the wood move slowly and possibly avoid cracking that way. But I've no doubt that if you take an instrument from England and you take it to India, it's going to have issues.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Hawks bases were built for military bands, and they travelled through the continents. I have one in my workshop. Well, I had one in my workshop that I restored that had a repair labels from Germany, England, India, in the Philippines, and I put a sticker on it when I got it to Sydney. So it has quite a bit of a journey in its life. But
yeah,
yes,
it's a world traveler. Wow.
The issue here is we can move that from a dry climate to a humid climate in a matter of hours on a plane.
Yeah.
So or even a matter of minutes if you take your bass outside of your centrally heated house and take it into another environment where it's humid. Well, I actually don't know because we don't use central heating here so much, but certainly air conditioning. You can have an air-conditioned environment, and you can take the bass out into the middle of a nice summer day where it's nice and humid, or humid, as Arnold likes to say, and that can cause all sorts of problems.
That sudden change, it's that rather than the gradual change, maybe if it was on a ship for a period of weeks or months.
Wood is an interesting subject. Wood is anisotropic, which means it has different properties one direction to another. It's not like plastic, which moves and flexes, if it does, in the same direction exactly the same way. Wood has long fibers, so along the wood, it's very, very stiff generally, and doesn't shrink in that long direction. But it does shrink in the lateral direction across the grains, and it's much more flexible across the grains. Wood, even when it's dried, breathes. It absorbs moisture and it lets out moisture, which is the swelling and shrinking that we're talking about. Just say for a bass back, low about 600 millimeters across, even if it shrinks by 1%, that's quite a bit of that's 6 millimeters, isn't it? So you'd imagine across the whole back, if the whole back is going to shrink by 1% or 6 millimeters, where's that going to happen? Okay, it happens across all the fibers, but if you're constraining them from moving, it's just going to open up a crack somewhere. If you see what I mean. If you're stopping them from moving, it's going to open up a crack. So by allowing those grains to move, that in theory minimizes that propensity of the wood to crack when it shrinks.
This episode is brought to you by Robertson and Sons Violins. For more than 40 years, over 4 decades, Robertson and Sons has specialized in providing the highest quality stringed instruments and bows to collectors, professional musicians, music educators, and students of all ages. Their modern facility, which is totally beautiful, by the way, if you're ever able to make it out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, I highly recommend it. They have a recital hall that they use not only for performances, but it's available to their clients. So if you want to try out a fine pedigree bass or even a student bass or anything in between, you can go in that recital hall. I've had the chance to do that. Totally amazing. I'm like a kid in the candy store when I'm down there at Robertson's. Check them out online at robertsonsviolins.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Whenever anybody's going to the Midwest, and I lived in Chicago, Illinois for years and years, I tell them to go to A440. If they're looking for a bow, if they're looking for a bass, if they need some repairs done, if they have a student who's looking for an instrument, A440 has been serving the community for years and years. They're located just west of Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago. They do great work, and they've been a big supporter of bass events over the years, whether it's the Chicago Bass Festival or really any bass event. A440, you guys rock. Check them out at a440violinshop.com.
Okay. Yeah, it's fascinating. There was a talk at the VSA on wood shrinking, on what was the talk exactly about? It was
drying?
about it was
Drying?
about it was about kiln drying versus air drying, and then I wish I had recorded that one. It was a totally fascinating conversation, but they like back in the old days, the advice was go put your wood out and leave it outside for 5 years, 10 years, whatever.
Yeah.
But they were talking about how that only gets it down to a certain level of humidity. You're not going to get it down, and how kiln drying or some of the various methods, you want to get it down. I don't remember what the percentage was, but if you get it way down, they refer to it as the big shrink. Like if you get the wood,
Yes, I know that. It was Robbie probably doing that talk. Robbie Mackintosh.
Yeah, can you talk a bit about that? Because it was a totally fascinating kind of talk, and it was definitely over my head, but also I think a lot of people would like to hear about it.
What I'm understanding is from that, my understanding is that is if you shrink something, it'll have a degree of spring back when you stop shrinking it. So you dry something out and it'll shrink. You imagine even a piece of foam. If you have a piece of foam and you squish it, maybe not a piece of foam, but I'm trying to think of what would be if you shrink something, it has a degree of spring back, and you shrink it again, there'll be a bit of spring back. But if you shrink it if you keep shrinking it, each time you shrink it, there's a little bit less spring back. So the idea is that you're drying the wood, you're drying it past a certain point, and then when you stop drying it, if you like, if you sort of let the humidity do what it wants, when it wants to expand, it doesn't expand quite as much. And you can just keep shrinking, keep drying that wood. You're never going to stop it breathing. You're never going to stop the wood from absorbing moisture and letting out moisture. If you get it down below a certain point, it becomes much more stable. And that's one of the things about old wood, I think. One of my favorite sayings is that old wood doesn't grow on trees, and which is a good reason to preserve it. But one of the reasons it sounds good is because it is very dry and has had that process of shrinkage and movement over its life and has reached a certain stability.
It's an interesting topic. I one of many fascinating moments for me last week.
Yeah. Yeah, but when I think about this though, luthiers like to work with wood that's stable. Doesn't necessarily have to be dry, but we want a material that's stable. We don't want it to crack. We don't want it to shrink. We don't want it to do all these things that it does in response to changes in climate, because that's really what you're looking at. It's what happens when the climate changes, when the humidity changes. That's what puts stresses on the wood. And that's why we're looking for a material that's been stabilized either by the drying method that Robbie says, or by humidity cycling, putting it outside in the shed and having it there for 20 seasons or something like that. My approach to it is, because I don't have a lot of control over the seasons, and I find I don't think putting little wet sponges inside a bass, which is what those what do you call them?
Yeah, the dampits.
The dampits. That doesn't do anything. It just causes other issues. You can't just humidify one part of a room. You can't just humidify a bass, in my opinion, even inside its case. Maybe a little bit, but not enough to really make any difference. And so my approach to making and repair, is to try to approach it from the point of view that I'm not going to fight the wood, and I'm going to try not to cause any issues where the wood might, if it shrinks, might be constrained against doing so, or might somehow cause a crack.
Yeah.
So, if you like, I'm trying to put together in my head, I mean, luthiers like systems. They really want to find a system of working. And you can go and learn from other people a system that they use, and violin schools, for example, have a system that they teach, and people who go to those schools learn a system from the teacher or teachers at that school, and that works, and it's really efficient. You get there. I never had that experience. I've had to work out what I do pretty much on my own, apart from some trips to Oberlin and some online help from people like Nick Lloyd and Arnold Schnitzer and Ken Mackay way back when I was starting off in mid 2000s. So yeah, I'm looking for ways that the changes in humidity, to minimize the effects of changes in humidity on an instrument, so that it really doesn't matter that much that I have wood that is as stable as a piece of MDF, if you like. If you see what I mean.
Yes.
I realize I'm working with wood of all different kinds, and it's, even when it's very dry, I have some wood that I've rescued from an old fireplace that I'm going to use to make an instrument, and it's going to be very, very dry, but I can't predict that that's not going to swell or move at some point. What I can do is, when I'm building with it, is think about what causes the cracks, what causes the constraints, and try to avoid that if I can do that at all. Well, just enlarging on the idea of a system, instrument makers like to have a system because that enables you to repeat what you've done before and improve on what you've done before, but it also makes things more efficient if you know this is how I do this part of the operation. This is how I approach this. And you learn those, as I said before, from teachers, but quite often I find is people who teach these things, you ask them, why do you do that? And they can't answer. The answer is, well, that's the way it was taught to me and I do it that way. And I'm the sort of person that doesn't accept that. I must have been very annoying as a child, asking why all the time. But one of the things that's done me very well in my life is to question dogma at all turns. If something doesn't make sense, or I don't understand something, I like to ask why until I get an answer that satisfies me. And an answer that satisfies me is not going to be one that says, well, it's just always been done like that. I want to know why something is done a certain way, and quite often there is a good reason for it. But sometimes sometimes things are done a certain way because it's easy to do it that way.
Yeah.
Totally. Some people ask why a bass bridge why the bass bridge is set up so that the back of the bridge is flat and the front of the bridge is planed off at an angle. You've noticed that?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really because that's the way that the bridges are made. They're made out of a wedge-shaped piece of wood, and they're put flat onto a bandsaw bed, and everything comes out perpendicular to one of the surfaces. And when you're working it and when you're planing it, it's very convenient to put it flat on your bench and playing down. Once you start flipping it over and curving over the back of if you want to, some people like to plane the back of the bridge a little bit as well. I've never really understood. Nobody's really been able to explain to me why satisfactorily that's a good idea, so I don't do it. But it's just much easier to work with this piece of wood if it's flat on the bench. Similarly, I have a theory. People say, well, the sound post must be inserted with the grain perpendicular to the grain of the top. Okay, why? Well, it sounds better that way. It doesn't damage the grain of the top. All this answers, but the simple answer, I think, is because when you stick your sound post setter into the side of the grain, there's only one way you can stick it that it will hold. And when you put it in through the sound post, that's the way the sound post sits. And that's the simple answer. That's why it's done that way. No other reason. So, it's
just practical. Yeah.
It's practical. There are a lot of things that are really practical things. Why are a lot of, okay, it's probably going to be controversial what I say, but most makers make basses out of maple and spruce. And it's a very traditional, those are the most traditional violin family making woods to use. And I haven't used them much because in Australia they don't grow here, so I've tended to use things that grow here or things that I can actually get without too much difficulty. But over time, people say, well, nothing quite sounds like a maple and spruce instrument. Nothing else will do. Well, I question that a bit because a lot of basses are made out of other woods, as you know. There's a lot of other people now are using walnut, and the old masters used pear wood and lots of different woods. And I heard Seth's podcast he did with you where he talked about the different combinations of tonewoods. Yeah. But, of all the woods that I've used, the nicest ones to work with are maple and spruce because they're both very clean woods. They're not aromatic like cedar, or they don't seem to cause allergies. They carve really nicely. Maple is a beautifully figured wood. It's white. It carves really nicely. There's nothing quite like carving a maple scroll. I've carved scrolls in other woods, but nothing carves quite as nicely as maple. So from a purely practical point of view, they are the nicest woods for a luthier to use. And your instrument comes out beautiful and white, so that you're varnishing. You're not having to match the colour of the varnish of the top and the colour of the wood of the back, and having all the sort of complications that you get if you're making a walnut bass, like I think Mitch made a walnut bass and a spruce top. Now the spruce is always going to look a pale colour, and the walnut is very dark, so he's going to have a job to actually match the colours. So just from a purely practical point of view, they're lovely woods to work with, and they don't seem to cause allergies or toxins or anything like that, like some of the more exotic woods do.
That was a major topic of discussion at last week's event, for sure. The use of different woods, and they had this great display of maybe 15, 18 different woods that are being used, and we're talking about different tonal properties, and it was totally fascinating. And it's interesting that maple and spruce, maybe the net result isn't acoustically superior to any of these other woods, but just from a maker perspective, that non-allergenic, easy to carve. So though that's
one aspect of it. Yes, I mean, if you go to the wood pile and I think I want to build an instrument and I want to make my life easy, I'm going to go and choose maple and spruce, and I know that the players are going to be happy because they're naturally conservative. But from a point of view of me working with the wood, those are nice woods to work with, but other woods work very well too. I've made 3 bass tops out of western red cedar, which is available here as construction lumber. It's kiln dried, but it's extremely stable. It's used in windows and door frames, and I can get it in large chunks. This is different to work with to spruce. So I look for very nice, tight-grained pieces of western red cedar, and they make great bass tops. A little bit softer than spruce. It doesn't scrape well. Spruce is a lovely wood to work with because you can scrape the grain, and you get a nice corduroy effect. Western red cedar just tears. It's really difficult to do that. So you end up sanding it a lot of the time and scraping it with a lot of care. It's just not such a nice wood to work with. Plus, it makes me sneeze. So I have to work with it outside. I have to wear a mask. I mustn't rub my eyes. All that sort of stuff. It makes great instruments, but I approach it with a bit of hesitation because of that kind of allergenic property it has. I think, as Seth said, it's Seth Kimmel. I'm talking about his podcast he did with you. It's a balancing act between the wood of the back and ribs, which is the box, and the soundboard. And I believe most of the sound is generated by the soundboard and the arching and the thicknesses of that. The back and sides are a kind of filter, and they will absorb a certain, and it's the way they're built, the size of the sound box, the method of construction, the method of bracing if you're using a flat back, the arching if you're doing a round back, all that is a kind of filter for the sound that is generated by the top. And by matching things together, you have some control over the sound that will come out. But honestly, Jason, there are so many variables in making a bass. It's not just one outline. Everybody's got their outline, their rib depth, the angle of the back compared to the top. Some people taper. Some people have Arnold's beautiful ergo bass, asymmetrical ergo bass. Different kinds of woods, different thicknesses of linings, different approaches to doing top arching. So many variations that it's really hard for anybody to predict accurately exactly how an instrument's going to sound when it's finished, unless you follow the same procedure with several basses using the same wood. And even then, you end up with instruments that are subtly different. So it's anybody who says that they can accurately predict how a bass they're going to build for you is going to sound is blowing smoke a little bit, I think.
Yeah. It's got to be a fascinating and sometimes frustrating and craft, and with so many layers and your path to this I read on your website you used to do documentary films and you were a screen editor. How do you now find yourself making these award-winning basses and doing what you're doing? What was your path to becoming a luthier?
I was born in England and emigrated to Tasmania in around about 1970. And I went to school in Tasmania, which is a little island at the lower end of Australia. I stayed there for about 10 years, and there I picked up the bass guitar and played in school bands and played in a band after in my final year, and that was great fun. I studied sciences at school mostly, and I did some woodwork with my dad. He tinkered around in the shed. But then I got accepted into a film school in Sydney, which was rather selective. I lucked out and I moved at the age of 18 up to Sydney, and I've been here most of my life since. But as a result of that, I graduated as a film editor, and I worked as a freelance documentary and drama editor for about 12 years. I went to live in France for a couple of years, and I came back married, and I continued my editing, but I found it very difficult to actually make ends meet because of the nature of the freelance work that it was. It was a great job, fantastic job, beautiful storytelling job, but I just couldn't make ends meet reliably enough to buy a house and start a family. So I took a job with a film studio teaching the editors how to use computer editing, because that had just come in. So we were using these very expensive computers. I think they cost about $120,000 with giant hard drives of 2 gigabytes. But I stayed there and worked my way up until I was the general manager of that film studio, and stayed with that government organisation for about 20 years. I moved into administration and management, but around about 2004, when my kids were in high school, I found that I dug my guitar out. I hadn't played music in all that time, and I dug my guitar out from under the bed and started strumming away on it, and found myself tuning it down all the time. The bass was obviously deeply ingrained in me, and I had a motorbike, an old Spanish cafe racer motorbike I'd built up from bits, and I'd never ridden it, and I'd carted it around with me for many years. And I decided that if I ever rode it, it would probably kill me, and my family wouldn't thank me for that. So I decided to sell it, and I got more for the bike than I had anticipated. And I put a couple of grand under the mattress, so to speak, and looked around for a bass. And then I walked into a shop after searching around bass guitars and things. I walked into a double bass shop, which I didn't know existed, and kind of discovered the double bass at that point and fell in love with it and thought, well, this is the instrument for me. So I bought one, ply bass, took lessons with a good friend and colleague, Dave Ellis, who currently shares a workshop with me in Sydney. But at the time we were both, he was playing and teaching. After a while I discovered that I needed a nicer bass than the one that I had, but I couldn't afford it. So I thought, well, I might try and build one. And I bought the Chandler book, and I made a bass in my garage, and it turned out really nice. And I had such a good time, I thought, well, I'll build another one. So I built a copy of Stefano Sciascia's cornerless bass. That bass, you might have seen it. It's Arnold's shop at the moment. That's a beautiful bass. Out of both of these basses had Western red cedar tops, and it just grew from there. I started to get repair work. I started to get restoration work and set up work, and I kept building. And one of the things I did when I built my first bass was I started to do a work in progress blog on TalkBass. And I think I was probably one of the first people to do a bass build and take photographs and put it online. And that's probably my documentary background. But as a result, I had a lot of help from some generous people like Arnold Schnitzer, as I said, and Nick Lloyd, who were at the time very willing to chip in and give me pointers both publicly and privately. I didn't find any help in Sydney or in Australia for that matter. I found the whole, the job was a bit of a closed shop and still is to a degree, which is one of the reasons I love Oberlin, because Oberlin is just a wonderful place with a wonderful spirit, and everybody has the same goal, and there are no secrets and very little ego. And I have some very good friends that I love to see, and it really shattered me not to be able to come to Oberlin this year.
It's one of those amazing, I wish every profession had something like that, because it really, it's remarkable. You know, I'm watching these presentations from all these different people that are there. Everybody's got their notebook out and they're jotting down ideas, and it's really incredible. Like I said, I wish that I had some event like that, you know, at different points in my life, and it's so cool because I think the violin making profession at least has a reputation, to my mind at least, as being very closed off, right, with these secrets that are passed down and now. But then you go and you see, and obviously the VSA they're you know is working to be open with that sort of thing, but man, on the bass side of things, it's so remarkable. There are no secrets. Everybody's working to discover new things and lift each other up. So it's just really inspiring.
Well, one of the things about basses is that they are a lot more work physically and material wise and time wise than a violin, but a lot less pay. Mm-hmm. So it's really not a really good economic proposition to become a bass repairer. Not all bass players have a lot of resources, particularly jazz players who go from gig to gig. They're carrying their bass to a different place every night. They get scratches, they get knocks, they live a hard life, but they're not on a salary. They're just jazz musicians or whatever. And when something happens to their bass, it's going to cost the same or more than if that same damage happens to a bass player who's in an orchestra on a salary.
That's a very interesting point.
It's very tricky for us, because if we charged as much as a violin repairer charged, we'd be laughing, but we wouldn't have any clients. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't be laughing, if you see what I mean. Every bass that comes into the shop ends up getting much more value than we actually charge for, if you see what I mean. There are so many things that all bass luthiers talk about this. When you work on an instrument, you're working on an instrument you love, and this is why we do it. But you don't charge for a lot of the work that you do. It's just very hard to charge. If you charge for every single minute you spent looking at the bass, tapping it, working out, thinking about it, working on it, it's very difficult to do. So all luthiers do this. They all admit, you know, when you get a bass in here, okay, I'm going to charge you a certain amount, but if I really counted the hours, it would bring my hourly rate down, right the way down. So you put in the time, you fit it, you work it out some way, and you try and adapt what you're doing to the needs of the player. One of the things I do, which is what I really like about my workshop, in fact, the main thing that I do is problem solving. And some of the problem solving involves how can I repair this in a way that's going to last. It's going to be done in the time that you're allowing me because you're a busy player, and it's going to be done in a way that you can afford. So it's not just bass luthier is not just scaled up violin luthiery. Basses need a special approach of their own, and quite often it's a practical approach. It's a matter of getting a repair done and out the door again, so that you can. There is obviously a right way to do things, and you can look at the Weishauer book, which is the Bible for violin luthiers, and that will show you the Weishauer's way of doing things, which is a nice system to follow. And if you ever get stuck, that's a good reference point. But not all of that technique scales up nicely to bass size. Sometimes you just have to find a solution that gets you somewhere quickly. It's not every time you get a broken scroll, it's nice to be able to say, you need a scroll graft. That's the only solution.
Right.
Well, it is on some basses, but on a lot of basses with a cracked neck or scroll, a scroll graft is just totally uneconomical. By the time you've done it, the instrument is just not worth it. So we have to find other ways of doing a repair that will last. In the case of a student bass, if you can make the bass last another 5 or 6 years before some other kid drops it, or it becomes a total write-off, well, that's worthwhile doing. But you won't do a scroll graft. And there's a whole lot of repair techniques, and that's why it's great going to Oberlin and hanging around with people like Robbie McIntosh and David Gage, who have some great practical approaches to doing repairs, and repairs that actually last, and things that work, instead of doing, a very common repair that people do when you've got a cracked scroll is put pins through the side of the peg box, wooden pins or metal pins or screws. It just doesn't work. So we have to have there are other approaches to that. And that's the job. It's problem solving.
I'm Jory Herman, and I'm one of the newest members of the Los Angeles Philharmonic double bass section. Last year I began using the Diodario Kaplan strings and really love how they sound and what they can do. As a young bassist, my first memories of playing the instrument were actually on the Diodario Helicore strings, so you could say that I've been using Diodario products since about 1994. Throughout college and my early professional life, I tried many different types and gauges of strings, and even experimented with mixing and matching from different sets. I would put 3 strings from one set with the lowest string from another, or maybe just change out the top string or do half and half, but never was really fully committed to the entire set from a single brand. Kaplan strings, however, do everything that you need them to. They have a crisp articulation while remaining warm and resonant from top to bottom across all strings. They have an immediate and clear response without maxing out in the loudest section of the music, all while still being delicate and singing in the softest sections of the music. All around, they're an incredible set of strings for the orchestra bass section.
This episode is brought to you by Upton Bass, and have you checked out this new travel bass from Upton? Oh my goodness, what a cool looking design. What a great sounding bass. It's just totally remarkable. And the way that they're launching this product, it's just so perfectly Upton. It's bold, it's innovative. You got to check out these videos of Gary Upton unfolding, I don't even know how you describe it, putting together, I guess, this travel bass. It takes almost no time. It is in a Samsonite piece of luggage. I kid you not. It is just a suitcase. It is literally a suitcase bass, but it comes together and it's a real bass. It's a nice sounding bass. So cool. Just another example of the way in which Upton is innovating and blazing new trails for the bass community. So thank you for what you do, Upton, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast.
Yeah, what a great place to learn what other people are doing. And I loved how every time Robbie McIntosh would talk, everybody would get real quiet and listen in. And he's like sharing these pearls of wisdom, and all the other people that are sharing and figuring out what you could do to help others and work on these basses. And you called, I believe you're referring to the basses you work on, but you called them your patients on your website, like a doctor with his patients. And I love that. I haven't heard that before, but I love that. That's such a great way of thinking of what you're working on.
Well, I do approach basses like patients. I think basses are very like people in a way. Everyone is different. There are basses that look similar, just like some people look similar, but each one has its own personality. Each one has its own voice. And that's why that's the secret to selling a bass is finding a bass that matches the player. The player has to find a bass that has a voice, has a look, and has a voice that attracts them. That sounds obvious, but it is. You can't sell any old bass to any old player. So the work that I do is very much like my workshop is a bit like emergency in a hospital.
Right.
I have triage, which happens on a constant basis. So somebody comes in with a fallen soundpost and needs a job and has a job that night. Well, obviously that will go on the bench first, and I'll pop that soundpost back up and out the door. That's an easy, quick fix, and they can go. But as I do that, I'll give it a bit of a checkup, and I will notice a few things about them. And obviously this is a good business for me as well, is to actually let people know what issues they have with their bass. I'm providing a service for them, but also I know that they will probably eventually come back and get those things fixed, and that's just my approach. So when I'm dealing with an instrument and I've prioritized it, and I have several jobs running at once, which is the only way I can make this job efficient for a solo operator, is to have several benches with several jobs running at once. I have to analyze all the ailments, note them down, and treat each one. And it's kind of like being a doctor. I'm trying to put together in my head, and maybe eventually on paper, a kind of ideology, a manifesto or creed or something like that, which I suppose is a system, an approach to repairing and restoring instruments and treating instruments. I feel a bit like the doctors. I think, well, who was it? There was one of these ancient Greeks. Was it Hippocrates or somebody like that? The Hippocratic Oath: don't do any harm.
Yeah, that's right. Hippocratic Oath.
That's right. Okay, so something like that, but something that educates what I do. So I'm writing down a list. I have a list of things which which seem to crystallize my approach, because sometimes you're faced with a repair job. You really just don't know how there's so many things wrong with this. There's so many things to do. What do I do? How do I approach it? What am I going? What's affordable? What's practical? And what's going to work? I like to treat, when I'm doing a repair, I like to treat each repair as a separate thing. Each crack I approach as a separate object. I don't like to say, well, look, I'm just going to repair this 3 or 4 cracks in close proximity. I'll just repair them with one strap across the whole lot and it's done. That doesn't really work. Each of those cracks is an illness, is an ailment, so and has to be treated separately. I try not to do anything that will create new problems. And there are a number of techniques, a number of ways of using cleating inside the bass, a number of ways of using bracing, using materials, reinforcing materials, glues and things like that, and using and varnishing and retouching. There are some techniques that do cause problems later on, and these are things that, when things come through my workshop, my practice is educated and informed by seeing those problems. So I'm trying not to create new problems. The other thing is the bass has a life, and it will have a life beyond me. So I try to use materials that have proven longevity. Materials that last, particularly glues and wood and things like that. I don't use any. I don't use white glue or anything like that. I use the traditional glues, except when I'm doing some modern composite techniques like laminating. But any of the fixtures to the actual instrument, anything I'm gluing onto the instrument is done with hide glue because it's proven and it works and it's clean and it's the best solution. I don't assume that the repair that I do will be the last repair that instrument ever gets. You can't really have a crystal ball and say, well, look, I've repaired that crack, it's never going to open up again, because you don't know how that bass is going to be treated. You don't know what's going to happen. You might find that something else happens to the instrument and adjacent to the crack that you've fixed, and as a result, what you've done has to be taken off by another luthier. And this happens all the time. We're always redoing other luthiers' work because either it doesn't last or there are other ailments with the bass that need to be treated, which mean that you've got to undo some of the work that was done there before. So that's the thing I keep in my mind. I'm not the last person to see this. So that's why
it's a good way to think about that. The more you're describing it, the more I realize how many parallels there are between patients and basses and how they are like people. It's so true.
Yeah. Well, also, I think, all right, I'm not the last person to see this. A lot of the work I do inside a bass, my dad said, well, only the angels will ever see that. So why are you worried? I said, well, exactly. But somebody will open the bass one day and they'll look at what I've done inside, and I'd like to feel that somebody says, well, that was done right. So I like to make my work very neat and clean and tidy and look nice. It has to look nice as well as do the job properly. And also I want to be kind to the next luthier. I don't want to do something that the next luthier that pulls off a fingerboard ends up with nails or staples or whatever in their sharp tools, or they just have a terrible job getting a top off because I've glued it on too tightly or something like that. So I think, well, it might be me that's going back into this instrument in 5 or 6 years' time, or it might be someone else. But if it was me, I'd like that top to come off easily. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's such a great way to think in service of the profession. And these, the principal bassist of the San Francisco Symphony here where I live, he spoke to me once about how we're just stewards of these instruments. These instruments have a life beyond us, and you're totally like, I think that just what you're describing resonates so strongly with that.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons I kicked my job in management in the film industry, is because I really didn't feel after 20 years that there was anything that I'd done there that was of lasting significance, that had, and I don't know whether it's just because I'm getting older and I feel like I'd like to do something that had some lasting worth, or whether it just I needed a change. I needed to apply all my creative urges and concentrate those onto in one area. I thought by making a bass, I'm making an instrument that unless something terrible happens to the world, this instrument has the potential to last and make beautiful music and move from hand to hand for hundreds of years. And so I need to make it as beautiful as I can, and I need to make it as strong and sturdy as I can, and I need to make it to sound as beautiful as I can so that people will look after it. People wonder about the old instruments and how all the old instruments sound fantastic. Well, that's interesting too. Makers several hundred years ago made lots of instruments and only a few survived. I don't think every instrument they made at the time would have sounded fantastic. But the ones that did, and the ones that were built well and looked good and sounded fantastic, were looked after. They were passed on. They had a value, and they're the ones where the value has climbed and climbed and climbed and climbed, and now they're rare, so that adds to the value of them as well. And they also happen to sound good. Cream rises to the top.
For sure. And both Jim Ham, when I was talking to him, and then also Arnold Schnitzer, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of the best instruments, the best double basses there are the ones being made right now. They're just not old yet, so but just the craft and it has come so far especially in the last 30 years or so. And it's got to be really exciting to both make something that lasts like you're doing, like I hope I'm doing with the podcast. I've totally felt that same thing you're talking about. Like, what am I doing that has any lasting impact? So I think it's really satisfying to find something where it does perpetuate. Someone will hopefully, someone will open up one of your basses, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 100 years from now, and see and fix that crack that someone, they moved to New York in the winter and it got a crack or whatever they got, it's really cool to find something like that and have it be what you're spending your time doing.
It's a bit, when a restoration, opening up a bass is very much like archaeology. It's like a combination of surgery and archaeology.
Nice.
Surgery because you're going in and you're digging out bits of material that don't work and getting rid of the cancers and the growths and the bits that don't work and replacing them with things that do work. But it's a bit archaeology too, because usually there's somebody who's been in there before.
Yeah.
And not everybody leaves their mark in there. But it's interesting. Everybody wants to know where a bass was made, who made it. It's really interesting, but it's not always possible to do that. You can identify in older instruments where you think what area of Europe they were made, because there were schools of thought that said this is how you do it there, this is how you do it in Mittenwald, this is how you do it in Mirecourt, this is how you do it in England, and this is how you do it in Italy, in Cremona. So older instruments, yes, you can sort of say, well, this is a Germanic instrument, this is a Saxon instrument, but it gets harder and harder because people started to move around, so they took their skills with them. Vincenzo Panorma went and worked in London, so that's why a lot of the basses that are made in England have a bit of an Italian influence as well. It's when you open a bass, you want to find out who made it, where was it made, and everybody asks that, and it's very rare that you can actually say unless there's a signature there. And sometimes the signature is fake or non-original or illegible. You have to make you have to look at it and say, well, look, in the balance, it has a signature on it. If the signature is authentic, then that's what it means. Or if that sticker on it is authentic, that's what it means. And you can do more involved detective work on it. In the case of a valuable instrument, you can go in there with a microscope and a UV light and try to discover the sequence of making, or you can look at the wood and try to identify what sort of wood it was and where it is likely that wood came from. But there's always a bit of guesswork there. And sometimes in a bass, I think about the next luthier and I say, well, I've done a bit of work on this bass, but just for reasons, there might be time reasons, there might be cost reasons, there's some of the work that I decided not to proceed with at this point. And there are some things that is that in that bass that is the result of a previous repair that I had nothing to do with, but at some point that should be done. So sometimes I make I print up a little label, a tiny little note, and I just write the little story of this repair and say, I've done this, there's a previous repair there, this is what I've done on this bass, and I'll stick it inside in some inaccessible spot where only another luthier will see it.
Wow, I love that. It's like a time capsule or something. That's whoever opens up that one of these basses is going to be so happy to see that in the future.
Or I mean, some people put their repair label in a bass, and when I started off, I started doing this and said, look, this bass proudly restored by Matthew. But I tend not to do that now. But I do usually put my initials on some of the work, just so people can identify if they don't already recognize my work, because I think every luthier has a style of repair, for example, that you can kind of identify, especially in a certain, if you're in a certain area. What I like to just put my initials on some of the work that I've done, so that there is a little bit of a link there, and people can say that cleat there, that wood that he's been using for that repair, it's all the same. Therefore, it's all by the same person. I'd like to have a little history. I've often thought it would be really nice if basses had a little logbook that you just slip inside, you write the repair, who did it. Some people used to do it on labels. They would write this on they would write what they'd done on the label and put the label inside, and that's sort of marketing and advertising for them. Nowadays, I don't think we need to do that. We've got Facebook.
Right.
But what I find also is that some of the repairs that were deemed smart 50 or 60 years ago turn out to be awful now. They didn't last. They've used materials. I've come across quite a bit of work where epoxy has been used inside the bass. Mm-hmm. And in the 1960s and 1970s, this was a wonderful new glue, so strong.
Yeah.
Gap filling, wonderful. Let's glue it. Let's cover it. Let's do it. And it's very common in instruments of a certain age to have the repairs glued like that, or white glue. But if the bass suffers damage or cracks, which happens with instruments as they get older and they shrink and they have a hard life, removing that is very difficult. The only way to remove it is really physically. You've got to cut it off. You've got to plane it off. And that inevitably means damaging a little bit of the wood underneath. So the tops get thinner with time. The ribs get, not so much the ribs, but the top certainly. It's made of soft spruce, and if you have to plane, normally when you're removing cleats, you'll remove the previous repair, and then you'll just soak the last bit off with a bit of water, and it just rubs off, and the hide glue comes away, and you really haven't damaged the substrate. But when you've used a glue that attack, like 2-pack epoxy, and it's really sort of, I don't think it soaks in, but it really attaches very strongly to the wood. But interestingly enough, it doesn't stop the wood from moving. It'll still move on the other side of the plate, and the cracks will open up on the varnish side. You've just got to cut that off. paint stripper sometimes will soften it a bit, but that also has an effect on the wood underneath. So you've just got to be really careful.
You're echoing what they said. We did this roundtable discussion at the VSA workshop, and glue came up briefly. What glue to use, and it's like hide glue, period. So no epoxy, nothing like that.
Well, there are some cases that's the ideal case. But again, getting back to being a practical repair person, if a school bass comes in with a badly broken neck, scroll's been knocked off, very common, and it's been knocking around in a storeroom for a little while, so you can't just put it back, and it doesn't fit exactly. Hide glue requires two surfaces to meet very closely. Hide glue doesn't fill gaps. Very often, if it's a school bass, you reach for the epoxy because you know that it's really not worth doing a scroll graft. It's really not. Hide glue itself is not going to work. You're going to need to fill that gap with something sort of goopy and sticky, but something that's really strong. So for school basses, very often that's an approach. When it comes to a master bass, no, you wouldn't. You would treat it differently, and you would use hide glue only, unless it's kind of in an area of the bass which isn't an integral part of the bass, and at the time you decide that's the best glue to use. But yeah, I don't use epoxy apart from gluing. If I might use it. Well, I do use it for gluing in a carbon fibre insert into a neck, for example, which is something that a lot of luthiers do now, is they put a carbon fibre right in a neck. Well, hide glue doesn't stick to carbon fibre. But when you think about it, even with the old basses, the neck is kind of a disposable object.
Right.
The scroll is original and valued and treasured. The bass body, the top, the back, the ribs are old and valued and treasured. The neck, well, look, it's interesting. That's your interface with the instrument. That's where you touch it. That's a really critical part of it. But it's one part of the instrument that if the scroll or the neck gets damaged, the best repair is to pull that right out, make a new one, graft the scroll back onto it, and put it back in there. And put a new fingerboard on it, and there you have your new interface with the instrument. So using epoxy in a neck repair, or using it for carbon fibre, I think is legitimate in some cases. But I certainly would not glue a neck to the body of the instrument with epoxy. You would use hide glue and make sure the mortise fits exactly.
Wow, what a cool craft! What a cool art! What a great what an exciting time to be doing what you're doing. And we hopefully, I don't know if you're going to Lucca. Are you making it out to Italy for that?
I would love to go, but it's August, and that's peak period. I said to myself, if I can sell a bass between now and then, possibly I can give myself an excuse to go. But leaving it to the last minute means that flights from Australia are going to be very expensive, and accommodation left to the last minute is going to be very expensive. So unless I feel quite reckless, I think probably I won't be going this year. But I would love to.
Well,
just look at ISB are both the ISB and the like are just fantastic experiences that every bass player should experience at some point in their life.
Yeah, for the player perspective. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the player perspective, the maker perspective, it's just got to be a great to go to those, whether it's Bass Europe or the ISB convention. So I hope to see you in person in 2019 in Indiana. Hopefully you can make it out.
I will be there.
Okay, great. Well, it would be great to catch up with you and do a round 2 or maybe a panel discussion or something like that for the podcast. I never have any set questions, except I usually do ask some sort of advice for your younger self thing. And you've done obviously a lot of things in your career, not just what you're doing now. But if you could go back and talk to young Matthew while you were back in Tasmania or at any point, when you were younger, any advice you might give your younger self?
Oh, that's really difficult, because I really wouldn't. I just remember when I was a teenager, I was making musical instruments. I was trying to do it. I was drawn to it because I didn't have the resources. I couldn't buy a guitar. I didn't have the money to buy these things, and I was making them, but I didn't have anybody to show me. My dad was and still is a woodworker, and he taught me how to cut straight and how to sharpen tools, but he had no idea about a guitar neck and how to stop that warping. So I made instruments. And I used fencing wire as strings, and I wound my own pickups and made my own little distortion pedal and soldered it into a tobacco tin and did things like that. But I had no one to show me what I was doing wrong, and so I left it and forgot about it. So. And really what's happened in my career is that I've come full circle. I'm back doing the things that I was naturally drawn to at age 14 or 15. So I suppose if I was to offer myself some advice, is if you find something that you enjoy doing at that age, remember it. Keep working at it. Find a mentor. Find somebody. Be persistent. Because that's probably always in you.
Yeah.
That's the point in your life where if you're lucky and have had a reasonably, unless you're, look, I'm very fortunate. I had some loving parents. I went to a good school. I was in a really nice country, and I was lucky to have a lot of freedom. But that's the time in your life when everything is available to you if you look around. When you start to get onto the grindstone of actually earning a living, that suddenly starts to put constraints on what you can do. There's only a certain amount of time in the day for hobbies. You've got to work, you've got to earn a living. And I'm really lucky now to have a job where it's not a job. It's just what I do. It's what I love to do, and it's just what I do. It's part of my life.
Thank you so much for chatting, Matthew. Folks, check him out online at bresquebasses.com. We have the link to that in the show notes. And I hope to see you again in person. If not in Lucca, Italy, then at the ISB convention or some event like that. And I've had such a great time chatting with luthiers for the podcast. If you go to contrabassconversations.com/luthiers, you can find all the conversations I've done with people over the years. And we've had some really great talks. So thanks again, Matthew. And thank you for listening to this. Maybe this is your first episode. Maybe this is your 510th or anywhere in there. But regardless of where you are in this journey, thank you so much for joining me and joining Matthew. And I have so much fun and learned so much doing these each and every week. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Steve Hinchy, Michael Cooper, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch is making beautiful basses just east of Dallas. Speaking of that VSA workshop, Mitch was there. It was so great to hang out with him, and it was great to talk with Matthew about Mitch and about all the other great folks that go to that workshop and that are doing beautiful things in the bass world. If you're looking for a bass, Matthew is making basses in Australia, and Mitch is making them in Dallas. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. And thank you also to Krista Copper for archiving and cataloging all of these episodes every week. So helpful. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you each and every week from San Francisco, California, and we'll see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.